Mr. President.
Senator from Rhode Island.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would request that the quorum call be vitiated.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I rise today to recognize a very painful milestone. This week marks the 3rd anniversary of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Over the past 3 years, the world has witnessed the incredible bravery and resolve of the Ukrainian people as they have stood up to Russia's unspeakable brutality and destruction. We have seen, and indeed the United States should take great pride in having led, an impressive coalition of nations coming together to support Ukraine in this fight to preserve its democracy. At the same time, an alarming convergence of authoritarian states, Russia, China, Belarus, and North Korea, have banded together to enable Russia's illegal war of choice. As we mark this milestone, we are faced with another frightening set of developments. President Trump has set his sights on negotiations with Vladimir Putin to end the war. But before reaching the negotiating table, Mr. Trump has appeared so eager to reach a deal that he's been willing to acquiesce to Russian demands for essentially nothing in return. Even worse, he has deliberately excluded Ukraine and Europe from the discussion. And we've seen this playbook before. Most recently in Afghanistan. In 2020, President Trump, eager to achieve a quick deal, negotiated directly with the Taliban and excluded the Afghan government from the negotiating table. He capitulated to Taliban demands, including the release of over 5,000 Taliban fighters, and blindly agreed to a 1-year withdrawal timeline, even as evidence mounted that the Taliban was not holding up the meager demands in the agreement. I fear President Trump has not learned any new negotiating skills in the 5 years since. The tenets of his approach to Ukraine and Europe appear to be the same. Exclude and criticize American allies, capitulate to our enemies, and withdraw support without any assurance of success. Earlier this month, Munich was the scene of another capitulation when Vice President Vance and Defense Secretary Hegseth kicked off Trump's giveaway campaign to President Putin. The historical irony is unmistakable, since Munich is a place that has inauspiciously become a shorthand for the appeasement of tyrants. In 1932, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain left his meeting with Adolf Hitler in Munich, and after surrendering Czechoslovakia in exchange for a peace pledge, when he returned to England, Chamberlain waved about a piece of paper with Hitler's promises and declared peace in our time. In reality, it was the beginning of the capitulation that would lead inexorably to the greatest war in history. Hopefully, this administration's rush to appease Vladimir Putin will not lead to the carnage like that of World War II, but it may cost Ukraine its sovereignty and independence while also undermining the international order, the very same order that America and her allies created from the ashes of World War II. Let's review the bidding so far. To begin, Defense Secretary Hegseth's speech in Brussels at the Ukraine Defense Contact Group set a shameful tone for the American delegation in Europe. The Ukraine Defense Contract Group, or UDCG, was created by the United States under the Biden administration. It has organized and led the international effort to support Ukraine, which has enabled the Ukrainians to significantly repel the Russian invasion and continue the fight to protect their homeland. The United States has led this effort throughout the war. I regret that Secretary Hex's first appearance marked the retreat of Americans' role as leader of the UDCG. In his remarks, he said, quote, "We must start by recognizing that returning to Ukraine's 2014 borders is an unrealistic objective." He further stated, quote, "The United States does not believe that NATO membership for Ukraine is a realistic outcome of a negotiated settlement." In essence, Secretary Hegseth conceded away our most important leverage against Russia. His statements, echoed by President Trump and Vice President Vance, have already badly weakened and undermined our negotiating position by gifting the Russians with several unilateral concessions. All of these forfeits were made without any apparent consultation with the Ukraine or our NATO allies. Again, the short-sightedness of President Trump and Hegseth and Vance statements are alarming. NATO has been the bulwark against Russian aggression in Europe since 1949. The alliance has more than doubled its membership since its founding. Central to the enlargement is NATO's open door policy, enshrined in Article 10 of the North Atlantic Treaty, which affirms a core NATO tenet that any European nation that demonstrates a willingness to contribute to our collective security and the values and obligations of the NATO alliance may seek membership. Vladimir Putin does not get to dictate who may or may not become a member of the NATO alliance, just as his Soviet predecessors could not stop the membership prospects of Poland or Hungary or Germany. To preemptively surrender admission to NATO is a national security malpractice and only benefits Vladimir Putin. Finally, Secretary Hegseth declared that Europe and NATO are no longer priorities of the Trump administration. In his words, quote, "We're here today to directly and unambiguously express that stark strategic realities prevent the United States from being primarily focused on the security of Europe." Further, quote, "The United States faces consequential threats to our homeland. We must and we are focusing on security of our own borders." I agree that the security of America's homeland is our #1 national security mission, but I reject Secretary Hegseth's myopic view that the American national security establishment is so fragile and so constrained that it must shift the entirety of its focus to the border security mission at the expense of other national security imperatives. Moreover, border protection is a civilian law enforcement mission. Deploying large numbers of military forces to support the Border Patrol is a gross misallocation of forces and raises numerous legal issues. The administration's shameful claims have been a shock to Ukraine, NATO, Europe, and the democratic world at large. They have provided great comfort to Putin and autocrats everywhere, which is a shame. In addition to Secretary Hegseth's speech, Vice President Vance took the stage in Munich and further eroded our status in the world. He castigated European allies for his perceived grievances with their domestic politics and alleged movements away from, quote, democratic values, while at the same time remaining silent on the brutal dictators in Russia and Belarus who have a free or fair election, have never had a free or fair election in the course of their tenure. President Trump gave his tip of the hat to autocracy last week when he attempted to revise history by alleging that Ukraine, not Russia, started the war, and that President Zelensky was a dictator in this situation. These categorically false statements are either a product of deliberate deceit or historical delusion. President Trump even directed the acting U.S. ambassador to the United Nations to vote against the UN resolution condemning Russia's war against Ukraine. The U.S. instead voted in a bloc with Russia, Iran, North Korea, and other authoritarian nations, which is a stunning reversal of decades of American foreign policy. This toxic revisionist history has now pervaded his political nominees as well. Throughout the week, his political appointees have contorted themselves in order to avoid acknowledging the fact that Russia was responsible for starting the war in Ukraine. This is something straight out of North Korea, where facts, quote unquote, are the sole purview of the dear leader. We must also note the deafening silence from many of my Republican colleagues. Many Republicans claim for years to be unapologetic supporters of Ukraine, who are outraged by the perception that President Biden was not sending enough U.S. support to Ukraine. But now they appear to be standing by silently as facts are erased, as the pipeline of aid to Ukraine peters to a halt, as the Trump administration disbands federal task forces established to seize the assets of Russian oligarchs and guard against foreign election interference and disinformation campaigns. Silence is complicity. We cannot allow this to continue. If we are going down the path of negotiations with Russia, we must act to strengthen our hand in these negotiations. And ironically, Russia is in a very weak negotiating position. Let us briefly review Putin's situation. Over the course of 3 years, Ukraine has inflicted a staggering cost on Russia. Putin has lost 200,000 soldiers and many hundreds of thousands more wounded. He has lost hundreds of billions of dollars of military equipment and weapons. Indeed, Russia's weapons and logistical stocks are perilously diminished. Their closest ally in the war, Iran, is weaker than it's been in decades due to Israeli and U.S. actions. North Korean soldiers sent to reinforce flagging Russian forces are suffering severe casualty rates. Russia has been ousted from Syria, and its Wagner mercenaries in Africa are struggling to reorganize. The Russian economy is afloat but stagnant. Any shrewd negotiator should recognize that Russia is on the ropes. Now is not the time to appease Putin. This is the time to exert maximum pressure to bring him to the negotiation table, hat in hand. There are 3 things we must do now. First, we must continue to pressure Russia economically. This means strengthening existing sanctions, identifying secondary sanctions, and bolstering sanctions enforcement and anti-evasion efforts. At the top of the efforts to control the evasion of these sanctions, we should be working with allies to combat the illicit oil trade, including efforts to go on the offensive against the so-called ghost fleet of aging tankers Russia employs to facilitate the export of oil and other sanctioned goods. Second, we must work with our European partners to impound and leverage Russia's frozen assets. And finally, we must ensure in both word and deed that Ukraine has our support and commitment to working with them to establish a just and lasting peace. However, instead of taking action to strengthen the negotiating hand on any of these fronts, the administration has shifted focus to the signing of a deal to exploit Ukraine's natural resources. Much remains to be seen about the shape of this agreement, but we do know it will take years, if not decades, to see substantial returns. A large number of Ukraine's rare earth deposits are actually located in Ukrainian territory that is currently contested or occupied by Russia. I'm not sure how one is to square this agreement with Secretary Hegset's comments about the forfeiture of Ukraine's sovereign territory. Furthermore, the deal includes no security guarantees from the United States, which the Ukrainians had rightly, I believe, insisted upon. Security guarantees are essential to assure Ukraine that the United States is not simply interested in an enrichment scheme, but is committed to the pursuit of a just and lasting peace. Indeed, a just and lasting peace must be the final outcome. That is a United States national security imperative, one that has, at least until recently, enjoyed robust and vocal bipartisan support. We support Ukraine because we know that the war in Ukraine is not just a regional war. It is the most visible demonstration of the larger existential threat Russia poses to our national security. We support Ukraine to ensure that Vladimir Putin cannot achieve his goals, which are counter to our own national interests. We must be clear-eyed about this. If Putin succeeds in Ukraine, it will be the first piece in his long-stated promise to recreate the Soviet empire. If that happens, if we fail to learn from history and to see brutal and craven authoritarians for what they are and the threat they represent, we may again find American sons and daughters sent overseas to fight on foreign shores. I urge my Republican colleagues and my Democratic colleagues, all my colleagues, to speak up and stand with Ukraine. As they have done so for many years, let us continue. With that, Mr. President, I would yield the floor. And Mr. President, I would also, excuse me, I believe Senator Klobuchar is here. Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President, I rise today alongside my colleagues in strong opposition to the firings of scientists, medical researchers, and more at the Department of Health and Human Services. HHS is in charge of everything from preventing disease outbreaks to making sure that our kids are healthy, to ensuring that seniors can live with dignity. It directly touches more lives than any other cabinet agency. That's why the administration's mass firings of thousands of HHS employees are deeply troubling. When a new CEO comes in and wants to see a new direction for a company, they look at it, they look at all the divisions, they figure out their direction, they maybe cut a division, they maybe make changes to it, they look at the merits of certain employees, they move some employees to different divisions, and they figure out thoughtfully what's the right way and what's the best way for their company. This is the entire government, but that is not what is happening here. They are firing people across the board without regard for merit, without regard for function. They're firing some of the newest employees who are eager and excited to have their jobs. They're firing some people who were simply up for promotion, and that put them in a probationary status. They are not looking at what these people are doing or the value they bring to the workforce and to the American people. They're just doing it and getting on TV with the chainsaw. These are people who went into public service for a reason. They are people, in the case of Health and Human Services, who keep us healthy and save lives, who work every day to keep America at the forefront of medical breakthroughs and innovation. It's been our secret sauce. It has given the world the most incredible life-saving drugs and medical devices like the pacemaker in my state, That didn't just come out of one company. That came out of a lot of ideas, and that came out of a lot of universities, and that came out of people doing clinical trials, and that came out of a devotion by our country to moving forward. That's how we've gotten these life-saving cures. That's how we've mapped the human genome so that we are now starting to offer personalized medicine, drugs that fit people, things that work, things that cure diseases we never thought were possible to cure. That's how our economy has been so strengthened, and we've led across the world. You know, I've worked for years to cut red tape, and I know there's more to do. I know there's more we can do to make our government effective. And we can do that together. We can take the ideas from the administration. We can work on it in the next budget. We can make some changes. I support permitting reform, all kinds of things that we could do. But these mass firings in the area of medical research, this makes no sense. The Department of Health and Human Services is also tasked with implementing Medicare drug price negotiation, which I fought for years to pass into law, along with my colleague, Senator Welch from Vermont, when he was in the House, and Senator Sanders here in the Senate. This is expected. We finally passed it. It was part of the Inflation Reduction Act, and it actually says, hey, this sweetheart deal that pharma had with the Medicare, in which they can't negotiate at all and the prices are locked in, and so our country, people are paying twice as much as they do in places like Canada for the drugs, yet it is our taxpayers that put in the money for the research, or the VA, which works so well for our veterans. They're able to negotiate and get better prices, but not 50 million seniors. So what did we do? We finally ended the sweetheart deal, and we passed law. I would have been more aggressive about how many drugs you'd negotiate, because I understand that you start with a group of drugs, and pretty soon that's going to help people who aren't seniors, as we did with the insulin cap. That insulin cap, $35 a month, that was only for seniors, but actually Merck and other companies offered it to non-seniors as well, because we got it going with the biggest prescription drug buying group in the country, and that would be our seniors. So this Medicare negotiation has ramifications for everyone in this country. However, even though we only did 10 drugs at first, the Biden administration picked blockbuster drugs, big drugs that so many people take, like Januvia and Jardiance and Xarelto and Eliquis. Combined, in 1 year, just 1 year, when this starts next year, no one has refuted these statistics, 9 million seniors will save $1.5 billion in out-of-pocket costs in the first year alone, and save taxpayers over $100 billion in the next decades. That's just 10 drugs. They've now come up with 15 more drugs, including Ozempic and those weight loss drugs, and they've passed that torch now, or the voters have, onto the next administration. So now it's on them to negotiate these 15 and then pick 15 more and 15 more. Imagine how much money we can save, not just for the seniors, that's obvious, but also for the taxpayers, because we are footing part of this bill, and then ultimately it will bring down drug prices like they have in other countries. But firing the men and women who carry out these price negotiations put those savings totally at risk. You cannot take on some of the world's biggest companies, the pharmaceutical companies, with Band-Aids and a skeleton crew. That is not going to work. I think we all know that, which is so many of our seniors, when they're in assisted living with their long-term care, and people's parents and grandparents, as well as coverage under the Affordable Care Act, including over 2 million Minnesotans. In fact, Medicaid actually provides health care for 20% of my rural residents in my state. You'll see similar numbers all across the country, and more than half of all nursing home residents in our state are on Medicaid. I remember when my dad was in assisted living. He got late onset Alzheimer's. I found a place for him, and found the next place when he needed a little more help. And I knew, as his savings were running out, what that day was. I knew the exact month that he was going to run out of his savings. And then he would go on to Medicaid. And that was a safety net. I actually knew I couldn't keep him at the same place, but I knew a place I could have him go to. And he ended up dying a year before that date happened. But there are so many people in our country that know the exact date when their parent or their grandparent is going to be able to have that safety net of Medicaid because they've actually run through all their savings. Nationwide, Medicaid provides coverage for 2/3 of all nursing home care. And these cuts, with what we're seeing out of the House budget, where they have put targets on the exact program that includes Medicaid, these cuts will be particularly disastrous for people with chronic conditions, including millions of veterans who become sick or disabled as a result of their service. What is this all about? It's about funding giant tax breaks for billionaires. Yeah, over $2 trillion of that money, that goes to people that are wealthy, people making over $400,000 a year. I'm all for keeping in these tax cuts for people making under $400,000 a year, but I do not know why, when you're facing the debt that our country has and when you are dealing with people's needs with Medicaid and the like, that you would decide to add tax cuts and make permanent tax cuts for people who are making over $400,000 a year. We actually had a vote on this late at night about a week ago, where we asked our Republican colleagues, okay, well, how about for people making over $10 million a year? That was Senator Warren's amendment. She said, okay, how about if they're making over $10 million? Could we at least agree that we shouldn't cut their taxes? And unfortunately, our Republican colleagues, for that amendment, yelled out no. Then we said, Senator Kelly got up there and said, okay, how about if they're making over $100 million? Then we should add more tax cuts? Our colleagues voted against that amendment, which said we should not add more tax cuts for people making over $100 million when our country's facing the debt it has, when we've got the needs for people in nursing homes and the needs for people with child care and the like. So then they tried one more time. Senator Angus King, independent of Maine. He said, okay, how about for people making over $500 million? Then at least you can agree with us, right, that we shouldn't add more tax cuts for those people making over $500 million a year. And sadly, our colleagues voted no. Instead of cutting costs for regular people and their prices and groceries, they're cutting Medicaid, which provides health care for 7.2 million seniors, almost 40 million children, nearly 2/3 of nursing home residents, and millions of people with rare diseases. But this isn't just the numbers. There are moms and dads, brothers and sisters, friends and neighbors. I've heard from one Minnesotan who at 4 years old was diagnosed with Duchenne muscular dystrophy, which causes rapid muscle weakness, making it harder to compete in complete most physical tasks. But this Minnesotan, who's now 26, has been able to thrive because he has Medicaid coverage. He got an education, he got a job, he graduated with a master's degree in public policy, he's paying taxes. In his words, Medicaid gave him the affordable health coverage he needed to manage his rare condition. For him and millions more, the cuts at the Department of Health and Human Services put their lives and livelihood at risk. This week is Rare Disease Week. I've met with many rare disease patients. I'm the co-chair of that caucus. And they are in town right now to convene and collaborate with federal medical researchers, PhD students, other families affected, drug and device reviewers, and advocates. Many of these rare disease patients were looking forward to attending the rare disease event that was supposed to be today. And this year it was going to be a collaboration between NIH and the FDA because of all that integral work that goes on with drugs being approved and people with rare diseases. But that annual event was canceled because the people carrying that out, these people here with very difficult rare diseases, that was canceled because the people doing the event were fired. The mission of the Department of Health and Human Services, which the thousands of Americans who are fired work every day to uphold, is enhancing the health and well-being of all Americans. These mass firings are a direct affront to that mission. The building that houses the Department of Health and Human Services is named for Minnesota's Happy Warrior, Vice President Hubert Humphrey. It's been that way through Democrat and Republican presidents. He was a champion for expanding access to health care. Inscribed in the entrance hall of that building are words from Humphrey's final speech in 1977. By the way, he was someone who was loved right here in this chamber by Democrats and Republicans. Some of the most conservative Republicans mourned his loss, and they loved the guy. And this is what he said in his final speech here. The moral test of government is how that government treats those who are in the dawn of life, the children, those who are in the twilight of life, the elderly, and those who are in the shadows of life, the sick. And he added, given he had a child in his own family with Down syndrome and those with disabilities. The firing of those who care for kids and seniors and those who work on rare diseases and those who are bringing together our people who work on drugs that are supposed to solve and are solving the problems for these rare disease families, and those that are doing the approvals, and those that are doing the research, and the families that want to talk to them about it. They were all here, and they canceled it. Because just like that, Elon Musk came in with his chainsaw. Those families are not going to tolerate this much longer. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Senator from Vermont.
Are we in a quorum call?
We are not.
Thank you. Mr. President, I want to speak about the extreme cuts that have affected the Department of Health and Human Services, Federal Drug Administration, National Institute of Health, Center for Disease Control. You know, first of all, the DOGE operation starts out with a premise that it is attacking waste, fraud, and abuse. And I'm for that. Any place that we can save taxpayers' money by responsible assessment of what programs are working or aren't, anytime we can uncover waste or certainly fraud and abuse, I want to do that, and I want that to be done across the board, whether you're talking about health programs where they could be better organized or they could be more efficiently run to achieve the goal of better services for the people you represent and I represent, for all Americans. I want to do that. But how is DOGE going about it? And we're here to talk about how they're doing it in the Department of Health and Human Services under Mr. Kennedy. Basically, they're doing it by sending out firing notices to people. Over 5,000 people have been fired. And that includes 700 in the Food and Drug Administration, 1,200 in the National Institute of Health, and 600 in the Center for Disease Control. Here's the question, and the answer is obvious. If you want to make a program more efficient, do you fire the people first and essentially erode any capacity of that program to deliver the services that the American people need? Or do you study the organization? Do you kick the tires? Do you investigate and analyze where the issues are that can be addressed by a comprehensive plan that would include getting rid of any waste? It would include getting rid, obviously, of any fraud and abuse. But what DOJ is doing is not that. It doesn't have a plan. What it has is a decision to fire people. So essentially, DOJ is saying that if the higher the body count of people who were fired, then the more the savings will be. Well, there's truth in that. If you just fire people and they're not on the payroll, you're going to save taxpayer money. But does that mean that you're getting waste, fraud, and abuse out of the system, or are you just wrecking the program? And it clearly is going to be the latter. You're just wrecking the program because you didn't even take the time to examine what's going on and how best to do it. And think about it. You know, in the National Institute of Health, there are investigators, there's scientists. These are people who are working on research that's important to your state and mine about diseases, about cures, about vaccines, about pandemics, things that, you know, that American people are entitled to have some confidence in security that we have the best minds addressing health issues and focusing on cures to diseases that all of us can be subject to, or the people we love, that they'll be doing that job. But these people are now just fired. They're gone. And that means, just think about it. An NIH scientist, that's somebody who's probably got a PhD, went to one of our state institutions. It might have been a land-grant college in North Carolina or a land-grant college in Vermont. And there's probably an enormous amount of talent in that person who was able to achieve a PhD in scientific research. And there's probably a good deal of public investment in the career of that person, with the return being that that person is going to be doing research on trying to cure diseases. And that person may well have gotten some federal grants, including college assistance or PhD investigatory assistance. It could be hundreds of thousands of dollars that the taxpayers have really invested in supporting a person who's become a scientist, helping us on very important research that is really good for the American people. Boom, they go to work or they're at home, they get an email and they say, don't show up for work, you're fired. And you know, there's a certain cruelty in a lot of these notices because it also has an assertion that your performance has been subpar. And of course, we find out that there's been no performance review. And in many cases, these people who were fired, supposedly because of subpar performance, in fact, did just have a performance review that said, you are doing a fantastic job. Or think about Food and Drug Administration. I mean, their job is to review, among other things, medications that can provide life-enhancing, life-saving, life-extending, pain-relieving medications that Americans are going to need and can benefit by. The sooner that work of investigation gets done, the sooner that approval decisions can be made, the sooner cures get to market and to the folks in this country. Boom, they're fired. And again, these people, some of whom do have PhDs, as I mentioned, but others of whom have been like at the FDA for 15 or 20 years and have that institutional knowledge of how it works. These people are getting fired independent of any performance review, independent of any assessment of where do we need more people or where do we need fewer people or what are some of the functions that no longer need to be done versus some functions where we actually may need to enhance the staff to get a better job for the American people. So, you know, what's so bogus about DOJ is that it is not about waste, fraud, and abuse. It really is not, because there would have to be an investigation, a plan, people looking at how the functions are being performed. It is simply a mechanism to justify firing people and lowering the head count. And as I mentioned, you know what? That will, quote, save money, but it will destroy the capacity of these organizations that all of us agree are doing incredibly important work. It's going to destroy their ability to do it. So it's just mangling the services in the area of health and human services that are so essential to the well-being of the people of this country. And by the way, this has got a real economic impact, and it's the economic impact first and foremost among those individuals who lost their jobs. But it's a real economic impact because we're eroding the infrastructure of science, of inquiry, and of investigation for better health cures. And you don't destroy that and put it back together again overnight. That's what's so wrong-headed about the DOGE approach to things. Body count versus better service, better performance, more sustainability. Mr. President, you couldn't have a worse approach if what your goal is more efficiency, better service, and better outcomes. The other question that is going to be recurring for the American people is the likelihood, inevitability actually, of massive reductions in aid for Medicaid. Under the version of the House Budget Reconciliation Act, they have to come up with trillions of dollars in savings. The only place you're going to get that is by cutting Medicaid. And we've got a contradiction here because the president says he loves Medicaid, but he also says he loves the House bill. And the House bill does not love Medicaid. What the House bill does is it attacks Medicaid. You know, in Vermont, we've got 20% or so, a little more, of our folks who depend on Medicaid for health care. And it's kids from low-income families. It's seniors. 2 out of 3 of our nursing home beds are paid for by Medicaid. So you're going to have families where the kids are really trying to help their parents. Parents need home, they need a nursing home, and they're going to get kicked out, literally. That's what happens. Now, finally, what we know is why is this happening? Why are these firings on a mass level being made when there's been no study and no plan in place to indicate that that action will improve services or in the long run save money for the American people? It's being done because there is a goal to have a tax cut. And you know, that's a fair and square debate. What should our tax rate be? Should we have a tax cut? If we do have a tax cut, how do you allocate it? How much goes to corporations? How much goes to billionaires? How much goes to everyday people? But to have that debate without acknowledging that the way you're going to pay for it is by taking away health care for everyday Americans, that's not on the level. And that's what's happening here, is that there is an agenda. Get that tax cut. I happen to profoundly disagree with the tax cut for major multinational corporations, and I profoundly disagree with lowering taxes for billionaires. Totally disagree with that. But when it is the situation that we're going to pay for it by taking away nursing home beds from Vermonters, from folks in the Carolinas, that's really appalling. We should not do it. So, Mr. President, I'm here with my colleagues to defend our commitment to good scientific research, to good cancer research, to good health care access for poor kids and seniors, and to sound the alert that that is what is at stake, despite what the president may say about his, quote, love for Medicare. What he clearly has as his major agenda item is that tax cut. And I'll acknowledge we can have a debate fair and square about that tax cut. But I think it's incumbent on all of us to acknowledge that the path to the president getting his tax cut marches right through access to health care in an attack on Medicaid. Mr. President, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator from Delaware. Senator from Maryland.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to use my time to highlight the attacks currently being thrown at our federal workers and the unconscionable firings that are taking place. We've heard baseless and callous criticisms of our federal workers from this administration for weeks now. They're wrong, and much of what they're built on is a lie, and they're dehumanizing. This is, in fact, a witch hunt. Our civil servants are among the best of what our nation has to offer. They serve with no political motivation. Many have served for years under Democratic administrations and Republican administrations. They have one dedication: to their fellow Americans. It is a patriotic calling that they have all answered. They're not faceless villains. They are real people with real stories. People like a woman I spoke with who has served at the Department of Health and Human Services for over 35 years. She's been put on leave as a part of the president's executive orders. For her and people like her to be caught up in these partisan attacks is infuriating. The administration claims to be doing this in the name of efficiency. There's nothing efficient about gaining unauthorized access to private data and then blindly firing 5,200 employees across multiple agencies. There's nothing competent about cutting the workforce without any thought about how it would impact operations. This is not efficient. This is senseless, and this is heartless. NIH is based in my state of Maryland, and many of the workers there are among the 150,000 civil servants who call Maryland home. Each one of them has made a commitment to public service. Each one of them is a civil servant that I am proud to represent. These abrupt and improper firings have shaken up the lives of thousands of dedicated workers who do not deserve this treatment. And what makes this even worse is that attacking our federal workers doesn't just hurt them, it hurts all Americans, the people who rely on government programs to keep them healthy and safe. These aren't hypothetical concerns. These firings will have real-world consequences. Eliminating staff at NIH will delay the development and approval of life-saving treatments. Cancer patients will have to wait longer for promising new treatments as clinical trials still stall due to staffing shortages. This will slowly eliminate research and medical intervention and weaken our standing in global biomedical science. Cuts to an already understaffed CMS workforce will hurt patient care. We will see disruptions in medically necessary care and delays in payments to hospitals and other healthcare providers. Firing staff at HHS will cripple our ability to quickly identify and respond to public health threats. And right now, we're experiencing the worst flu season in over 15 years, resulting in school closures in at least 10 states. We're monitoring an outbreak of Ebola in Uganda. We're keeping track of the growing threat of avian influenza. Without a strong workforce, we will not be able to react effectively. And it's impossible to forget the significant role that NIH plays in developing and deploying vaccines and treatments. We are just beyond the clutches of the last major public health crisis, and without a strong workforce, we will not be prepared to face the next pandemic. In the clearest terms possible, these cuts aren't about efficiency. To the American people, it quite literally could be the difference between life and death. They are as direct a contradiction as you can have of the priorities this administration claimed to set when they took control: to ease burdens on families. Instead, these firings could add enormous strain to a nation that's already in need of relief. They're irresponsible, they're inefficient, and they're undeserved. What our civil servants deserve is a recognition of the work that they do every day to make us stronger. What the American people deserve is for us to keep our obligation to ensure their health and their safety. And I will continue to defend them and apply pressure to this administration until it happens. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The senator from Wisconsin.
Mr. President, I rise today to sound the alarm about what's happening to our nation's ability to advance life-saving medical research in the first month of the Trump administration. As many of you know, I am a proud graduate of the University of Wisconsin-Madison Law School. In many ways, I grew up at the university where both of my grandparents who raised me worked. My grandmother ran the costume lab at the theater department, and my grandfather was a scientist. He was a biochemist who spent 4 decades unlocking the key to how our metabolism works, in large part thanks to funding from the National Institutes for Health. My grandfather and his colleagues pioneered breakthroughs that impacted biochemistry around the world, leading to all kinds of developments to keep our bodies healthy, from nutrition and diet to advanced drugs to really so much more. And I share my grandfather's story because it demonstrates why the NIH is so essential. As the world's premier biomedical research institution, NIH invests in our health, our national security, our economy, and our future. These investments influence our nation's competitive edge, patients' treatment options, and simply put, American lives for generations to come. Research supported by the NIH has helped us find breakthroughs for treating diabetes, Alzheimer's disease, and substance use disorders. It's supporting clinical trials right now for patients battling terminal diagnoses for cancer. And in fiscal year 2023, the NIH generated almost $93 billion in economic activity, nearly twice the agency's budget. And the engine behind all of it is, of course, researchers and scientists, dedicated scientists like my grandfather, who right now are worried their life's work, the work of keeping our loved ones healthy and saving lives, is in danger. All because Elon Musk and President Trump are firing nearly 1,200 critical staff across NIH institutes and centers, halting life-saving research in its tracks, and indiscriminately and illegally freezing funding from going out the door to academic and research institutions across the country. Across the Department of Health and Human Services, Trump and Elon Musk have fired more than 5,000 public servants. We're talking about scientists, doctors, researchers, and so many others who are doing this critical work to keep us healthy. And Musk and Trump are going so much deeper than firing the HHS workforce, which is damaging enough to research programs and puts Americans' lives at risk. They're throwing sand in the gears of the NIH. Their basic grant-making operations to prevent scientists from getting the resources they need to conduct the life-saving biomedical research in the first place. For instance, the president has unilaterally fired more than 130 employees at the National Cancer Institute, many of them scientists. And across the NIH, Trump and Musk have fired more than 160 program officers, grant management specialists, and other key administrators whose job it is to get grant funding out the door to universities and other research institutions across the country. Since President Trump took office, his administration has canceled more than 70 NIH study sections and advisory council meetings that are the final step in grant approval. And this means that more than $1.5 billion in funding that has been withheld so far, illegally and in blatant defiance of court orders by this administration. The impact is already having ripple effects across the research community. Take, for instance, Alzheimer's disease research. The Trump administration has stopped tens of millions of dollars from going out the door for Alzheimer's research, halting studies, clinical trials, and moving us further from a cure. The Trump administration is also terminating entire NIH training programs focused on supporting early career scientists from diverse backgrounds and folks that are underrepresented today in biomedical research. And in its endless quest to cancel any program that even uses the word diversity, the Trump administration has even paused research involving women. And make no mistake, we will be feeling the impact of these cuts for decades to come. Universities are pausing graduate student admissions because they aren't sure they will have the funding to support the students they currently have enrolled. And what's at stake is not just a generation of talent and our nation's competitive edge. It's also the next breakthrough that could cure cancer or Alzheimer's disease. Thanks to President Trump, thanks to Donald Trump's actions, the United States may lose its global competitive edge in biomedical research and cede it to China. In Wisconsin, our universities follow a long-held tradition known as the Wisconsin idea. It's a pretty simple philosophy that says the work done at our universities should make an impact far beyond the classroom itself. And it does. From vitamin D to human embryonic stem cells to blood thinners and new treatments for Alzheimer's disease, Wisconsin universities and dedicated scientists like my grandfather have discovered breakthroughs that revolutionize the world of medicine and, more importantly, revolutionize how we keep our loved ones safe and well. So when President Trump and Elon Musk come after this funding, come after these public servants, they aren't just coming after scientists in classrooms and laboratories. The impact will spread far beyond those institutions. When they come after the NIH, they are coming after patients with terminal illnesses who are right now being turned away from potentially life-saving clinical trials because of these cuts. They're coming after the next breakthrough that could have helped your loved one battling Alzheimer's. They're coming after a young scientist who is living paycheck to paycheck, who will not be able to pursue a research career developing treatments to help others get better. Now, you may be asking yourself, why are Donald Trump and Elon Musk doing this? Well, the answer is pretty simple. So they can give tax breaks to billionaires. Why are they cutting off clinical trials and cancer research? So that people like Elon Musk don't have to pay their fair share. Why are they withholding funding to find a cure for Alzheimer's disease? So big corporations can pay less in taxes than the average American family. The cuts we're seeing right now will damage Americans' lives for the next generation. All so the wealthiest Americans can get wealthier. We must stand up to this illegal freeze on funding, this assault on the federal workforce, and these billions of dollars in cuts that will take decades to undo. Our health and the health of our loved ones depend upon it. Mr. President, I yield.
Chair recognizes the senator from Washington.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I come to the floor today to make a simple point. The law cannot be in the eye of the beholder. The law is the law. But yet again, we are seeing the Trump administration break the law. Many of us have been closely following the Trump administration's illegal freeze of congressionally appropriated funding, including of foreign aid, not just from the State Department, but also from USAID, the African Development Foundation, Inter-American Foundation, and other independent agencies. Each of those agencies' existence as an independent entity has long been enshrined in statute and reaffirmed by bipartisan majorities in both chambers year after year in annual appropriations. Our appropriations law also explicitly requires the administration to notify and consult with Congress before undertaking any efforts to reorganize, realign, or downsize foreign affairs agencies, as the sweeping reductions in force issued last week and many other brazen actions we've seen clearly seek to do so. The administration's actions, including firing the USAID Inspector General and the state IG, will make waste and fraud more likely and will prevent even foreign assistance programs allegedly supported by the administration from being effectively implemented, and will also effectively block hundreds of millions of dollars for other programs enacted into law by bipartisan majorities. Needless to say, the Trump administration has not consulted or notified Congress about these changes. That is in violation of the law. But this week, they took a further step. The Trump administration has chosen to spit in the face of the law and Congress, expressing total disdain for a court order mandating they release the foreign aid funding they had illegally withheld. When finally told they must comply, Secretary Rubio personally approved the termination of 90% of the USAID programs and 60% of State Department programs virtually overnight. They terminated more than $58 billion in multi-year programs and have told us they have no intention of utilizing those funds. The termination of those awards is absolutely not what Congress intended. Congress appropriated the funding on a bipartisan basis with the express intent to see those dollars spent. This is not trivial stuff. We're talking about resources that often mean the difference between life and death, resources that are imperative, not just because they are life-saving, but because they are an investment in our own national security and in U.S. businesses. Let's take Ebola, for example. USAID helps other countries around the world respond to and contain Ebola outbreaks. U.S.-based companies implementing these programs received termination notices yesterday. Any basic accounting of USAID's capacity to stop outbreaks abroad shows quite plainly any disease prevention efforts supported by the U.S. at this point are merely symbolic. You cannot break the foundation of public health systems overseas and expect that it won't have a damaging impact here at home. This makes America less safe. If Ebola, Marburg, or any other infectious disease makes it to our shores, it will be thanks to Elon and Trump, two billionaires without a clue who are positively smug about their own ignorance. But it's not just our infectious disease response that has now been gutted. Everything from resources to help prevent kids from getting malaria, to aid for refugees in war-torn places like Syria, where it is directly in our national security interest to foster stability. And it's not just resources for faraway places. This will hit home in blue and red states. U.S. universities in my home state, in Indiana, in Florida, in Texas, and other states have had their partnerships terminated. Mr. President, American students from across our country that are now participating in exchange programs overseas are impacted by this. To put it into perspective for my colleagues, 5,800 of 6,300 USAID grants and contracts are being terminated. That is 9 out of 10. And that is not to mention 4,100 of 6,800 State Department grants and contracts. And the only detail we have is from the NGOs, faith-based organizations, and U.S. contractors sending these termination notices to our committee. We do not have one shred of detail from the State Department, not one shred. The scale is staggering, and it shows you that this administration's scheme is to bulldoze right through restraining orders and court orders so that by the time the law does catch up with them, the damage will have been done. Compliance is easy at that point. What's left to fix once you've burned everything to the ground? This administration knows full well they are breaking the law. They are showing us all in plain view their goal is to do irreparable damage as much as possible, as fast as possible. Well, I'm here today to sound the alarm because this illegal power grab is in direct violation of congressional intent and appropriations laws. The Supreme Court should act with haste to bring this administration to account and ensure that money Congress appropriated gets to where it was intended. Whether it's President Trump or Elon Musk or the Secretary of State calling the shots, Congress has no visibility into DOJ's actions, frustrating our ability to write funding bills when government funding runs out in weeks. By ignoring the law and congressional intent, the administration has created chaos. They have eroded trust in the United States, and they made way for Russia and China to take advantage of this leadership vacuum. No one should fall for this thin veneer about efficiency while this administration racks up legal fees, overdue payments to contractors, pays people not to work, and forces a global recall of staff. We have a process, Mr. President, to avoid this kind of chaos. The President submits his or her budget request to Congress. Congress holds hearings publicly, writes and passes bills that become law. We have explicit notification and consultation requirements for foreign assistance funding for a reason. Mr. President, do I need to march down to the National Archives? Do I need to make sure we still have a Constitution? Do I need to check whether the laws we passed are even still there, or did they start running them through a shredder? Because as blatant and persistent as it has been, no one should expect this kind of lawlessness to fade away. I cast my votes and I speak on this floor as a voice for the people of the state I represent, Washington State. I was not elected to let the president of any party or some unaccounted billionaire to decide how their tax dollars get spent. Every senator here should speak loudly with one unified voice. Congress holds the power of the purse. No president can unilaterally abolish an entire agency or ignore our appropriation laws. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Under the previous order, the Senate stands adjourned until 3 p.m.